welcoming you as the chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much for being with us today on such an important subject, which is investment into South Africa in probably one of the things that is most critical is the backbone, the physical infrastructure backbone to the country, so that it can at least get its economy going and to move forward. Because where we are now is obviously a fairly it's a system that's not working, and a lot of areas of the infrastructure can be improved. And there's many aspects of that infrastructure that are impacting all aspects of imports and exports of the country, which definitely makes a difference once again to the balance of payments. So it is a major, major issue that we have to take very, very seriously as a country. So thank you for being here to support us. We have a large contingent of people that are online as well, who have joined us from around the globe, actually. And then we've also got our panel here today in person. I'd like to welcome all the panel. You have got a handout of the panel members who will be present either on the screen or in the room. And then we have, yes, no, I've talked about the panel. So, and then we have yourselves, who I have to say thank you very much for taking the time to come out. The number of messages I had today saying my train did X to me and Y to me, and I've now got the safety of being able to step down and get out of the way. So anyway, everyone has made it. We have got still quite a few people we are waiting for, but Your Excellency, it's a pleasure to see you. I'm going to get out of your space. Thank you very much.
Good morning. We look all bright and ready to go this morning. Program Director, Ms. Sharon Constakon, Chairperson of the South African Chamber of Commerce. Right Honorable Andrew Selou, Prime Minister's Trade Envoy to South Africa and Mauritius. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to South Africa House. I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning to discuss the important topic of infrastructure. It is an honor and a pleasure to have collaborated with the South African Chamber of Commerce, my dear friend here, Sharon, and ABSA in today's seminar on South Africa's infrastructure opportunities and challenges. The timing is perfect for two reasons. Firstly, it happens less than 6 months after His Majesty King Charles III hosted His Excellency President Matamela Ramaphosa for the first state visit of his reign, which demonstrated the importance the United Kingdom places on the relationship with South Africa. The theme of the state visit focused on trade and economic opportunities. Secondly, it happens a month after the successful 5th South African Investment Conference that was hosted by President Ramaphosa in Southampton, South Africa. Infrastructure is broadly regarded as the bedrock of economic growth and productivity, with well-functioning modern infrastructure being central to economic growth, social development, and equality, and a good quality of life for all citizens. South Africa's National Development Plan, NDP, sets out clear economic development targets, which is further supported by the National Infrastructure Plan 2050. These documents give guidance on the scale and direction of national infrastructure investment that is needed to achieve a vibrant and inclusive economy and quality of life for all citizens. The NIP 2050 is a whole of government approach to infrastructure investment in the medium and long term, and it cuts across different mandates departments, spheres of government, policy areas, and professional disciples. The NIP 2050 also recognizes that infrastructure investment has long-term impact and gestation. Therefore, it balances the vision of 2050 with the short to medium-term interventions that are required to set the country for a trajectory to achieve the target of 30%. However, ladies and gentlemen, I must say that past investment performances, particularly infrastructure investment, has fallen substantially short of these targets, highlighting the challenges that South Africa can deliver on infrastructure-led economic recovery plan. The investment gap is hindering economic growth and urgently needs to be addressed for South Africa to achieve the goals set out in its development plans, such as the NDP 2030. As such, we are looking forward to hearing the perspectives of all conference attendees this morning. Today, we really want to facilitate fruitful discussions with you, being reminded on the 13th of April 2023, at the 5th South Africa Investment Conference, our president set a target of 2 trillion in a new investment over a 5-year period. We need to work together. Government needs business and business needs government. We at the South African House are always ready to assist in your inquiries and in any interest you may have. I think we have a very interesting morning ahead of us. And once again, I'm honored that South Africa can offer such an appropriate venue for this gathering. I wish you all a successful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kingsley. Can I call on Denise to please say just a few words on behalf of our major sponsor? Thank you very much.
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Denise Coppin. I head up the international coverage team for ABSA here in London. Very much like to welcome you along to today's event. It's great, as Sharon says, to see such a full room and such significant interest in our subject of discussion. For those of you who aren't aware, ABSA is a Pan-African financial services group with representation in 12 countries across Africa. We're also proud to say that we have international offices in London and New York. Headquartered in South Africa and listed on the JSE, we are committed to empowering and enabling individuals, businesses, and importantly, nations. The development of critical infrastructure is key to the economic and social development of the continent. That goes without saying. And we're proud to be Africa's largest funder of renewables. However, we recognise that there are significant challenges to be overcome in resolving the infrastructure gap. As we focus today on the specific needs of South Africa, I look forward to hearing from our extremely diverse panel and audience as we explore opportunities and solutions. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Could I please introduce Andrew Selous, who is the Prime Minister's trade envoy for South Africa and recently Mauritius as well.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Your Excellency, thank you so much for hosting us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And it's a huge pleasure to be back in South Africa House again. I've been the UK Prime Minister's trade envoy to South Africa, and more recently Mauritius, for coming up for 6 years now. So I sort of market myself as part of the continuity in the system, because we had rather a lot of prime ministers last year, and ministers change, High Commissioners change, both here in the UK and in South Africa. And I think there is some value actually in having some of us in government who have a longer term view of the relationship. And it is an extremely strong relationship. Just to put it in context, South Africa is United Kingdom's largest market in the whole of Africa. 54 nations in Africa. South Africa is our biggest market, and we do fantastic trade together both ways. So each country really matters to the other. The UK has the largest stock of foreign direct investment in South Africa. And I'm particularly proud that more recently, the UK is the largest foreign investor in renewables in South Africa, something which I don't think we probably talk quite enough about. So I had the pleasure of going back to South Africa last month to look specifically at this area of infrastructure. And winding back a little bit last year, Minister Ibrahim Patel from the South African government and our former Business and Trade Minister, Mike Freer, signed a memorandum of understanding between our two governments on the whole infrastructure piece. That was followed up by some extremely productive, very warm, very friendly, extremely respectful knowledge exchanges between Infrastructure South Africa and the UK's own Infrastructure and Projects Authority, which I must admit I was not sufficiently familiar with before I joined in on some of those knowledge exchange sessions. And I think Infrastructure South Africa is an organisation South Africa can be extremely proud of, recently very ably led by Dr. Rama Hopper, who of course is the new now Minister for Electricity. And I think we have a really good team of professionals here in the UK. And it was fantastic to see professionals in both countries sharing knowledge and experience, the learning going both ways, the use of the UK's 5-case model, as we called it, being readily taken up by South Africa, slightly adapted, as is absolutely right. And then if we just wind forward a little bit to the state visit, which the High Commissioner mentioned, that memorandum of understanding on the whole infrastructure piece was a central part of the state visit. And then last month, I had the honour to be very warmly received by Minister Sile Zikalala, the new Minister for the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure in his department, with his Deputy Minister and his senior officials, both from ISA and from the department. And there was a renewed commitment to really get down to business between the UK Infrastructure and Projects Authority and Infrastructure South Africa. And on the week of the 29th of May, there will be a further technical follow-up visit by officials from our IPA back to South Africa. And I think we are really looking to start making things happen between our two countries. We are also looking to have a government-to-government agreement between South Africa and the United Kingdom in the whole infrastructure space. We have recent experience of doing something similar in Peru, where British, so at a government-to-government level, major British project management companies like Arup, Turner & Townsend, Mott MacDonald's, Gleeds, and so on, and others, were in charge of delivering a major program of investment in Peru for schools, drainage, water, other public buildings. And the model was that I think 95% of the spend was with Peruvian companies, and it was just the technical project management, which is an area in which the UK does have world-leading skills, was UK-led, and that would be a similar model that I think we would look to use in South Africa. There was particular interest in British companies like Maybe Bridge, who have the ability to put up rural bridges to fulfill the President's own rural bridge program pledge in very short order because of the high technical quality of those bridges. That would create a lot of local employment. And there is just a particular issue. That type of steel is not actually made anywhere in South Africa. And South Africa has signed a waiver to, as I understand it, buy railway girders from Austria when they are being stolen from some of the tracks that Transnet is responsible for. So we are hoping, given this steel is not actually made in South Africa, there'll be no loss of South African jobs in time. If it can be made in South Africa, fantastic. But we would hope that Minister Ibrahim Patel would agree to that waiver, because then Maybe Bridge, I think, can put up 2 bridges a week. I mean, fantastic rate of being able to put those bridges out, which is urgently needed. It's a presidential pledge. I also was privileged to meet with the Infrastructure Fund officials at the Development Bank of South Africa. We have a clear line of sight of bankable projects, some of which will require blended financing, an area that the UK has significant expertise in. And one area I am particularly excited about is the ability of the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer's Edinburgh reforms to move significant amounts of the £11 trillion of assets under management in the City of London into bankable infrastructure projects. So we want to do that here in the UK because we have infrastructure needs too, but actually we need a global portfolio of infrastructure projects. And as I never tire of saying, and some of you will have heard me say before, the City of London is massively underweight in African investment. If you're going to have a globally balanced portfolio, you cannot ignore a continent that will be a quarter of the world's population by 2050 and has some of the world's fastest growing economies, because there will be times when Asia has a downturn, something goes wrong in the Americas or whatever, and Africa will be the star of the show. And if you want a globally balanced portfolio that is going to deliver consistent returns, you have to be sufficiently weighted in Africa, and that is not the case in the City of London. So with these Edinburgh reforms announced by the Chancellor of the Exchequer a couple of months ago, I think there is a fantastic opportunity for our two countries to do more, and we need to get sort of fund managers in the City of London to sit down with Infrastructure South Africa, the Infrastructure Fund, Development Bank of South Africa, and so on, to really get into the detail of how this works both ways. But I do think that's a fantastically exciting piece. And you look at the city's expertise in green finance in particular, I think there is huge opportunity there. So I will also be going back to South Africa. The intention is that I'll be there the week of the 24th of July, just following the UK-South Africa bilateral. That's the highest level meeting that the governments of the United Kingdom and South Africa have. That will take place the week before, and off the back of that, we will have the second formal meeting of the investment task force, which I co-chair from the UK side. And that investment task force is already delivering with projects like Hive Energy, which is it's about a $5 billion investment in a green ammonia plant in Coca, the special economic zone in the Eastern Cape. I think it'd be the second largest green ammonia plant in the world. I think there's one bigger in Saudi Arabia. And green ammonia is, I'm told, what is going to power shipping. We hear a lot about decarbonizing land transport, about decarbonizing aviation. We don't hear so much about maritime. And South Africa, with renewable energy through the production of this green ammonia, I think has potential to be a huge world leader. And there are other places in South Africa, which I know Hive are also interested in doing further projects. We're also looking forward next year to next April to the African Investment Summit, the second one. It was very beneficial to South Africa the first time. So we would like to have a series of programs that we can announce then. And the infrastructure needs in South Africa, I think in total about 2.15 trillion rands worth of infrastructure. There is no shortage of work to be done. I think the UK has skills in areas like building information modeling. When I was the Minister for Prisons and Probation here in the United Kingdom at the Ministry of Justice, we were designing all our new prisons using building information modeling. It massively reduces the costs, it reduces the ongoing maintenance costs, and that is something that there is a skill here within the UK. I'm very proud of sort of knowledge exchanges we have in the whole hydrogen space, universities like Stellenbosch, Nelson Mandela University, linking up the Teesside University, Cardiff University, a lot of knowledge exchange going on between our universities as well as officials as well. So I think it's a really exciting piece. The next few weeks and months, we have to, roll up our sleeves, get our shirts off, get projects going on the ground. Your people need it. Infrastructure is a need all over the world. We already do great things together, and I'm extremely excited and confident that we can do a great deal more together. Sharon, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Appreciate your presentation and the insights that we got, and also the ongoing effort that the UK government is making towards investment opportunities into Africa and South Africa.
Thank you. So to lay a bit of context, currently infrastructure spending by governments in 2014-15 hit a peak of 262 billion rand in that fiscal year. Since then, there have been massive problems of underspending, institutional problems, policy problems, which caused it to fall back to 185 billion in 2020, 2021. But since it's rebounded actually quite quickly to 255 billion, the big problem we have, of course, is that this is in nominal terms. In real terms, currently, we're roughly a third of the spending by the state on infrastructure that we had back at the peak in 2014-15. And that's a massive gap. The amount of infrastructure spending in 2014-15 was still inadequate in many senses. And hence, government's been very busy institutionally setting up in the last 4 years various structures to aid this. Andrew went into some of the detail. There's obviously the hot topics of infrastructure in particular around energy. We had the President's Crisis Energy Plan in July last year, but we often forget maybe the boring parts of infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, these other parts which are equally important to boosting potential growth, and not forgetting logistics as well. I've been honoured to be part of the process of helping to form the President's Transport Logistics Crisis Plan that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time. Hopefully. And it's, I think, a reminder that the infrastructure needs are broad-based and complex beyond simply energy. To dive into the conversation with our panelists, maybe Ed, I can start with you. Working on the continent as well as the rest of the continent, as well as in South Africa. Maybe you can just sketch out for us how the opportunities in South Africa or the challenges in South Africa look versus the rest of the continent, and maybe some of the blockages that are particularly South African specific that come up in that context.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Peter. Sorry. So you want me to sketch out South Africa and the rest of the continent? Well, I think as we just heard from Andrew, the opportunities in Africa are vast, and as he said, looking forward, 25% of the population is going to live on the continent. Things like power, water, electricity, roads, they need everything. So the opportunity to provide some of that is vast. South Africa, obviously, is much more industrialized than other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So everyone can hear me, can they? Yeah. And so it has, I think, its own unique challenges around what it needs and how it can be funded. I think when you look at South Africa, it has, much more developed financing markets. There's a very deep and liquid rand market there that is very different from other parts of the continent. So things like local currency finance is much more important in South Africa. And of course, any government, it's much more efficient for them to be borrowing in their own currency, because of course you can print your own currency. So I think, and having worked on the continent for many years, we've done quite a lot of local currency export finance in South Africa. So I think South Africa can do that. I think it needs to do more of that and accessing long-term funding through banks, export credit agencies, and the bond markets, and particularly all of them, because when you look at the funding need, it's vast. So you need to be tapping all of those markets to access liquidity from them all. Because actually, as any sort of funder will tell you, if you've got a big requirement, you don't want too much concentration risk on any particular sort of investor. So the best thing to do is to try and tap all sources of financing. So, and I think South Africa can do that. It needs a strategic plan really to do that, and not just do a kind of project by project basis. Have a plan. Tap into some of the goodwill financing that's out there, things like the Just Energy Transition Partnership. There's a lot of emphasis and goodwill from G7 OECD to try and help South Africa meet its infrastructure financing needs and transition away from coal. So I think the opportunity is there. It just needs to be grasped.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think it's an opportune moment to move to Marianne online. In terms of the needs we heard there of South Africa, SAIS has done a significant study into the problems of infrastructure. I was wondering if you could contextualize for us, Marianne, and in particular, what you think that means for the scale of financing needs and how or if this is being addressed adequately enough yet by policymakers, because your report goes a lot further than simply the usual infrastructure areas that we normally think about.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the question, and good morning to everybody in the room and online. The South African Institution of Civil Engineering, who was the president of last year when we launched the infrastructure report card, looks every 5 years or so at infrastructure in South Africa. We rate infrastructure, and we have at the moment 32 subsectors. We rate infrastructure between A, world class, and E, unfit for purpose. And unfortunately, we had to report that the overall grade of South African infrastructure in civil engineering is a D-, which is very close, a very fragile, at risk of failure, and some of the subsectors go already into being unfit. So that is cause for concern. The reasons for that are obviously multiple, and some have been hinted towards already by previous speakers. There is not enough investment into infrastructure in South Africa. There is not enough investment into maintenance of infrastructure. When we do maintenance, we are reactive. When it starts failing, we go and see what needs to be done, rather than being proactive. And not being proactive just costing the country a lot of money. If I'm having a small crack, for example, in the road, and I attend to it now, it costs me X, let's say R1 or 100 Rand. If I wait 2 or 3 years, that 100 Rand has increased to approximately 800 Rand. And by waiting to our infrastructure almost failing, we do have problems, and we're spending too much money on maintaining infrastructure or having them at risk of failure. There are obviously other aspects as well. We do have disrespect of our infrastructure, so there is attack on our infrastructure, there is theft of the infrastructure, there is waste, there's protests, and we have corruption. And the third aspect that we are dealing with, and again, one of the speakers spoke about that, is the technical expertise. And it's not that there is not enough technical expertise in the country, and we welcome anybody assisting in that and mentoring young engineers, etc. But it's also where the technical expertise sits, and especially in, for example, municipalities where the spending needs to happen, the planning and the spending needs to happen, there is often not enough technical expertise.
And Marianne, how would you think about prioritizing for a financial audience? What needs to be done next? How can we go about thinking about that kind of problem, given the need is so great?
Yeah, it's the question then almost becomes: do we first invest in economic infrastructure, or do we first invest in social infrastructure? And generally, the need is there everywhere. But personally, and maybe I'm slightly biased, I'm a transport engineer, so I do think if we don't get our transport system, and if I say transport, it's roads, it's rail, we still do have very good freight lines, that iron ore lines, for example, that are functioning in the country. But we need to make sure that the economy carries on functioning so that the social aspects and the social needs that we have in the country are addressed. So from my personal point of view, obviously dealing with the electricity crisis and making sure that our transport system, so that freight and workers can get to work, is dealt with, would be my personal priority. When the economy is functioning well, there are many opportunities to make sure that then the social needs are addressed as well, so that, you know, clinics, hospitals, education, etc., is functioning better. So we need the economy to run to actually be able to invest in our social infrastructure.
I think that's great that you highlighted there's the non-economic social infrastructure as well as, of course, PPPs are equally relevant in that space. The Tyberg Hospital PPP, which is currently being undertaken by the Western Cape, is a key example. But Alan, turning to you and the infrastructure fund, how do you deal in this space of very tight fiscus? It's taken you a while to set up, but you are now fully going as a fund. How are you directing your resources given such broad need? And maybe you can just briefly introduce the fund to our audience as well.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning to everybody online and in person. Perhaps just a little background to the infrastructure fund so that we all understand where it comes from and how it operates. The infrastructure fund is a unit within the Development Bank of Southern Africa. It's a ring-fenced unit, and it's a creature of a memorandum of agreement between National Treasury, the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure through Infrastructure South Africa, which Andrew mentioned earlier, and the Development Bank of Southern Africa. So the three shareholders and signatories to the memorandum of agreement are those three, which then gives us our mandate to operate. So the key element of how we operate in the infrastructure space, Peter, is that we are looking to bring blended finance solutions to infrastructure projects. Now, blended finance is sometimes thought of as a bit of a dark art in the financing world, but the whole point here is to see how we can involve the private sector in investing in infrastructure development in South Africa. We've got our own internal targets in terms of the ratios that we are trying to meet. As you've mentioned, we are a new unit. We've been going for just over 2 years now, and we've managed to bring a number of projects online and bring some financing to those projects. We haven't quite met our target ratio, which is quite aspirational, of about a 1 in 10 infrastructure fund input to private sector input. And obviously then also there would be the fiscus contribution as well to those projects. So essentially we are looking to put together an instrument which helps involve the private sector in projects that are commercially attractive for the private sector, but also not keep the fiscus contribution involved as well. Thanks, Peter.
I'm wondering if you could maybe just highlight how that's working in practice with an example of a project, maybe how you help scale and unlock private financing, because it always seems there is a massive amount of interest from funds, from banks, but we have a scale problem that we're trying to hit here. So maybe an example of how that blended finance is working in reality.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Look, we are, as I said, we are quite new in the space at the moment. So a lot of the instruments that we've put forward are sort of debt instruments, and some of them are support grant instruments for bulk infrastructure. But we've also got a number of very large projects in the water space, and the water space for us is very exciting because it has both that economic and social component that Marianne was talking about earlier. And those are very large projects, so they're not moving very quickly. They're moving as quickly as they can, but they do take time. So the way we are supporting those projects at the moment is through providing an instrument which supports the social element of say, the water project in the form of a debt instrument to the implementing agent. And I don't want to go into too much detail around those, because those are projects that we're busy developing with the implementing agent at the moment, and they're still to be let out to the market, so I can't go into too much detail. But there's a range of different instruments that we're looking at, from grants, which we want to move away from, because we're not a grant providing organization or a mechanism. But we go through any instrument that will allow us to de-risk projects and to allow the private sector to feel more confident in investing in the commercial aspects of the project. So one example is perhaps a large water project, which has probably a 50% contribution by the mining industry. And then the other 50%, we contributing as the infrastructure fund, about 50% of the remaining, and the fiscus is then coming in with a further 25% there. And those that particular project will probably get to market in the next 6 months or so, but it's a very big project. It's a number of billions.
Thanks very much, Alan. I think it's interesting you highlight water in particular, and a lot of these projects are quite long, as you say, coming to market. We're seeing a lot of reform in the water area in particular. The Nawira bill, which quite radically changes the regulatory structure for bulk water, is coming forward as well, will make some of these projects a lot more bankable. So there's a lot going on in the policy space led by Operation Vundela and the presidency that helps the financing side of things like water as well. But we heard there about sort of blended finance de-risking in particular. Turning to you, Dinesh, the PIDG is a quite unique institution in terms of its ownership structure, how it works between the public and private sector. And this idea of de-risking infrastructure, of scaling finance through de-risking is very close to what you do. Maybe you could just explain briefly about what PIDG is for those who don't know, and some of the ideas you're deploying elsewhere that are quite relevant for South Africa.
That's great. Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everyone. So the Private Infrastructure Development Group is a multi-government backed organization, and the aim is to promote economic development in emerging economies through working with the private sector to promote infrastructure development. And that's a core precursor to economic development, right? So we need infrastructure there as a basic need to meet the population's needs. And so the way we do that, we have a range of different products across the group, ranging from upstream government engagement through DevCo, technical assistance grants, development equity for early stage development of infrastructure projects, and credit solutions. So that's long-term infrastructure debt and credit guarantees as well. And we try and differentiate ourselves by aiming to be nimble and provide innovative solutions to market challenges, because the markets we operate in always have challenges, but we need to find ways around them to make sure the infrastructure is deployed. And it's probably best characterized with an example in another part of Africa. So a number of years ago in Ghana, we came across a very capable local entrepreneur who had grown a local corporate and had established a good relationship with the local arm of an international bank. He'd wanted to start moving into the infrastructure space and had a greenfield infrastructure project he's promoting. When the local arm of the international bank took the project up to the international office, they weren't so sure about the project. So what we did, and what we think we do quite well, is look at the project, assess it, look at the entrepreneur, do the DD, and we thought is actually bankable. So we provided a credit guarantee through Goranko, the guarantees arm of the group, to the bank, who then provided a dual currency facility for the entrepreneur, who then proceeded to construct and operate the project all to budget, all to time. So that was great. And then the entrepreneur, we like to forge long-term partnerships. So this entrepreneur was growing and, having been successful in the first project, wanted to do more. The bank had reached its limits and appetite of that kind of asset class. So we thought, how can we provide access to the entrepreneur for new sources of financing? And what we did was structured a corporate bond using the credit guarantee from Goranko. And it was the first corporate bond ever issued in Ghana outside of the sovereign or the banking space. So by wrapping the bond, we attracted onshore pension funds to invest in the bond. And in fact, it was oversubscribed. And what that did was it provided a new route of long-term financing for the entrepreneur. So not just for this project, but for all his future projects. And it also helped to diversify the portfolio of the pension funds onshore, because before that, all they had were government securities and bank debt, and that was it. So it's these kind of solutions, long-term partnering, that we like to bring to the table.
And maybe I was wondering if you just discuss how you're getting interested in South Africa now. I think that's a somewhat new thing for you to maybe think about scaling there, the sectors you're interested in particular, how you think you can support scaling financing in South Africa.
So as things mentioned earlier, South Africa's got a very unique profile because it has an existing deep institutional investor market and a developed capital market as well. And what we're trying to do at Pidge is to find sponsors, projects, technologies and sectors and provinces where we can catalyze the private sector through using the various financial products that I mentioned. So examples that we're looking at the moment are C&I energy, energy trading, SEZs, affordable housing, and example products. So I talked about Garanco. So Garanco is now exploring providing framework guarantee agreements with banks. These are blanket guarantee agreements to do multiple transactions to help banks look at new sectors or nascent technologies that perhaps they're not as experienced in, and also using our upstream technical assistance facilities to help develop nascent technologies in these markets. But the key point is that we're looking to catalyze the private sector. We think the private sector needs to be bringing the solutions, and we're there to really bridge the gap on risk appetite of the private sector, and then to bring in the commercial financiers alongside with us.
Well, thank you. Michelle, turning to you, you're in a kind of similar space in terms of partnering with people to de-risk as well. Again, I think export finance is maybe not totally known to everyone in the room. Maybe you can just explain a little bit about what you're doing, and in particular, how your strategy fits in with the broader strategy that Andrew outlined earlier, some of the key sectors that you're interested in. I know you're much more focused now on South Africa and scaling your operations there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And good morning, everyone. So UK, so I'm part of UK Export Finance, the UK Export Credit Agency, and we are basically a ministerial department of UK government, a ministerial department, and our role is to promote trade, to promote exports from the UK by providing finance to overseas projects that procure from the UK. So in this case, we would be very keen to participate to the funding of the projects that Andrew mentioned, things like green ammonia, renewables, water project, but also in the social sector, education are all sectors where we are very active across the continent. We are very flexible as an export credit agency in terms of the procurement that is demanded from the UK for us to be able to support a project. So we have as a minimum threshold 20% UK content that can be made of goods and services and IP for us to be able to finance the whole of a project. As I mentioned, we have been very active across the continent. We have financed, very large transport projects. For example, in Egypt, we deployed about 2 billion sterling for the Cairo monorail, but also, going further south, we financed in Uganda an agriculture irrigation project. We have financed education projects in Niger as well. So we are active across the spectrum. And in terms of South Africa, we have a massive market risk appetite for the country. We have 4 billion sterling of market risk appetite, which we haven't been able to deploy to date. And I think this comes back to what Ed was saying earlier in terms of the liquidity that has been available in South Africa, and hence no need for export credit agencies to be involved. However, now with the massive infrastructure needs in front of us in South Africa, and again, coming back to what Ed was saying, maybe now is the time to think about diversifying the source of financing. And this is exactly where export credit agencies have a role to play. So we're very keen to work with banks. So maybe a word about how we operate. Our main product is a guarantee from the UK government, basically, to a bank, either international or local bank, which will provide finance to the project involving UK procurement. And this guarantee from the UK government should bring additional liquidity, but also might have an impact in terms of the pricing of the debts available. So yeah, very, very keen to work in South Africa and a massive market risk appetite there.
Cool, thank you, Michelle. Maybe you could just touch on the challenges of working in South Africa. I mean, the sort of local content question comes up a lot. You're obviously demanding, on the flip side, foreign content from the UK. How do you find a happy medium on those sorts of issues with a country where it's so political and such a hot topic like South Africa? Do you think that's really a blockage at the moment or not?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think it is a blockage. So as I said, we are pretty flexible in terms of the UK content that we require in a project. So it's about 20%, that's the minimum. But it also means that the rest of the project, so the 80%, can also be financed through UK Export Finance, because there is this 20% UK procurement in place. So that means that the local content can be financed through UK Export Finance as well, up to a maximum of, there are some rules in place by the OECD, so it's up to 50%, but a big chunk of the local content can be financed through export credit agencies too.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying that. Ed, did you want to come in?
I could actually. Just to because export finance is what I do in my day job, but as I understand it, local. I mean, there's always been a heavy emphasis, rightly, on local content in South Africa because, as I was saying, it's a much more developed market than other parts of Africa, and a big incentive to try and use local companies. But things like the energy sector, I believe the government has recently lifted some of the restrictions on local content, such as the need to get on and build things. So actually, there is really quite a big opportunity to look at where export finance can play a big role in things like energy financing. There's some changes coming through in the renewable energy sector, which means you can get potentially construction plus 22-year repayment terms under the OECD. So I can really see quite a lot of movement and more happening in the export finance space in South Africa, hopefully in the near future.
Cool, thank you for that. I think there was interesting news yesterday, the battery procurement round. They have lightened local content rules quite a lot to get that going, a 500 megawatt battery round coming there. Stephen, turning to you, thank you for waiting patiently. I wanted to talk to you about how a bank like ABSA, with the scale that you have, thinks about the pace of reform going on, the opportunities of the rise from that. There's a lot going on, as we said, in terms of logistics reform, water reform, energy reform. But a lot of these take quite a while. I mean, to turn around logistics sector will take, minimum sort of 5 to 7 years, with the policy changes that are about to happen. The energy ones are slightly faster. How do you see the pace of reform versus how you can deploy capital as a bank, and how opportunities arise?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and good morning to everyone who's in the room and online. I guess the power issue is top of mind, and if I look at the government's plan, they call it the ERRP, the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. If you look into it, you could see there is movement, albeit at a slow pace. And I guess what is frustrating the South Africans is the issue around energy. So if you look into that plan, there's a plan to sort of release spectrum in terms of the telecoms. That has happened. Within that plan, there is, as you correctly say, there's a part around reforming the energy, and that led into the energy action plan, which actually has 5 points or 5 pillars, which is, to fix ESCOM, but the biggest part there is to accelerate the private participation into that, and also reform the energy sector, because I guess in South Africa, we concentrated on one utility, which is ESCOM, and we forgot it's an energy system rather than having one entity. And so the reform there, as you have seen it, is to split ESCOM, have an independent transmission company, so that like any other countries, anyone who can generate, and then you have the transmission company then distributing. So we made a mistake of just looking at one entity instead of looking at the energy reform. So what we are seeing for coming out from this ERP document from government, really it's the private sector participation call, whether it's in the, let's talk on the energy space as a start. When the IPP started, say 2007 or 2008 to now, we have financed almost 10 gigawatts, 10,000 megawatts. But if you look into the reforms that have happened, which are, there is no cap on how much you can generate power for your own use. So we've seen a lot of mining companies who are big consumers of power taking that advantage of that reform. And as we speak now, we as a bank are seeing, just in the space of 18 months, we are seeing extra 10,000 megawatts of energy for what we call captive power, because either it's mining houses or anyone who has a big real estate wanting to put rooftop solar or having power for their own use. And so it took us 10 years to have 10,000 megawatts in renewable energy. Just the reforms themselves have brought extra 10,000, and all of those are at different stages of being implemented. So it does show that these reforms are definitely working. We wish that they could move as quick as possible into the logistics. So if you look at our Transnet entity, same story, albeit things are taking a little bit longer there, but they're looking at the ports, private sector on the ports, the Joburg to Durban container terminal, also private sector participation. Some of their very lucrative routes like manganese and iron ore, also looking at the private participation. So there is this theme coming out from this document, the ERP of private sector participation, which we welcome as a bank.
Thanks very much, Stephen. What are some of the steps government needs to take, though, to encourage a much more vibrant financing market? It seems like we had a lot of financial innovation when REAP first came about. That's now a sort of more commoditized products. We haven't maybe seen the volume of other infrastructure yet happening for similar innovation to happen. But what are the steps you think government could take to spur some more financial innovation in the infrastructure space?
And they're trying. I mean, me and Alan are in the same space where we wishing that the innovation that happened in energy can happen in water, because we are water and waste management. We are about, as our engineer community was saying, there's not been enough investment in that area. One of the things they tried to do, and we just as private sector must take up on this, was just to relax the regulation 28 to allow pension funds also to sort of invest a certain portion into the infrastructure. And we all of us are about to take that on and look at innovative ways, especially where there's a combination of commercial and social infrastructure, just to make sure that does not fall behind as well. I'm seeing a lot of the cities that are next to the sea, with the technology becoming cheaper on desalination, thinking around desalination. And what we're doing there is we are talking to them. Projects are still at early stages, but we are already using project finance principles around how we manage those projects. Some of them have blue chip companies that could be ring-fenced and be supplied with this pure water. And so those are some of the issues that I think there we must say the private sector must think more, of course, working with government in the risk-sharing matrix.
And Stephen, there seems to always be a problem where we focus on these very large national projects, maybe at the expense of municipalities. Municipalities, I think, struggle a lot broadly outside, obviously, some of the big metros with bankability problems. How can banks in general, banks like ABSA, get more involved in that space so they don't get left behind, we don't get widening inequality between bankable and unbankable areas of local government?
Yeah, and maybe let me start on the cities or the metros, as we call them this side, Peter. I mean, if you look at a lot of them, they were used to be financed at the top. You know, our balance sheet could stomach this. So I guess in any crisis, there are some opportunities. So some of them, as a country, we are struggling with this collusion governments, and we, as banks, we're very reluctant to extend those yesteryear long-term finance to some of these metros. And so even to some of them, we are talking this project finance light principles, where we have access to where the funds are and how the funds are going to be used, and exploring ways with the ways of the likes of the Development Bank of South Africa to project management, to project manage some of the projects. So slowly they're opening up to that because they can see there's not many institutions running to them like yesteryear to fund them at the top. Everyone wants accountability. We are aware that the backlog is huge, as Andrew was mentioning and some other speakers. And for us to do this, we need to know where the rents are going. So I think everyone is warming up to that, and the partnership here, it's very important. So Michelle, sitting next to my old colleague there, Ed, we need to be tapping into those funds that comes with a bit of skill and a bit of project managing those projects, so that the rents are doing exactly what they're meant to be doing.
Thank you, Stephen. I think the reform area around making infrastructure easier is only just starting to get going. We're seeing section 16 of PFMA up for reform now. That's going to make PPPs easier. Treasury is going to be coming forward with a paper on that into the budget next year as one example. But Marianne, earlier you started to talk on some of the problems at a particularly local government level. What are the sort of solutions that we need to ensure that local governments in particular can do infrastructure? We've had various entities in the state trying to capacitate them, trying to deploy engineers, that sort of stuff in the past has never quite fully worked. What are the things that need to happen at a local government level to ensure they don't get left behind in the infrastructure space?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think one of the issues that we see is that young graduates go to municipalities, also the more local municipalities, but there are no mentorship opportunities in those municipalities because there is a lack of technical capacity. So we need to find ways to support the people that are going into these local municipalities. And there are various ways, mentoring programs, etc., making sure that maybe we have systems where well-equipped technical people in South Africa have a few municipalities under them and actually go around and support these municipalities. I think from an international point of view, it's also important that we make sure that the infrastructure solutions that we identify, and again, giving support to people in metros, local municipalities, etc., are cutting edge. We have tried to solve infrastructure issues in South Africa, not always successfully. Although we have been building low-cost housing, we haven't closed the gap with regards to low-cost housing. So it's also time to start rethinking of how we're doing things, and yes, we need to make sure that labor-intensive building continues, but maybe we can do it in a different way. Maybe we can cast walls labor intensive in a factory and put up buildings much faster, for example. The water crisis, and I'm glad to hear that there are some solutions that we are thinking of, but reuse of water is not really happening in South Africa. How can we start investing in those type of systems and making sure that in the metros and local municipalities, we train and mentor people to make sure that they can implement these new visions. And in my own field, with regards to road and rail infrastructure, we need to make sure that those type of systems become much more resilient. If I look at what I've seen in Africa, the best, for example, sidewalk that I've seen, and I'm not saying that I have seen everything in Africa, was in Cameroon. Now, from a South African point of view, and as a South African, former president of SAIC and academic at the University of Cape Town, I find it very sad that we are not building the type of resilient sidewalks, roads, etc., that could be there. So I do think there is a combination of looking at how to implement our infrastructure in a different manner and making sure that we have training programs that support people that need more technical skills, that need to grow still more, that are in the municipalities. And as I said, mainly in local municipalities, we need to find ways to create and retain the capacity that we have.
But who do you think needs to take the leadership on that? Often government says it should be business says it should be government. It feels like we go around in circles on this issue a little bit sometimes.
Listen, I do think that planning different ways of creating infrastructure and services, water, etc., that is something that requires national planning, maybe piloting in different areas of the country and making sure that we learn from those pilots and then start applying. And I'm not even saying that the solutions are the same, for example, in water at the coast and more inland. But we need to learn, we need to pilot, and we need to learn. I do think that mentorship programs and making sure, and we're talking about governments, those are government positions, technical skills in government institutions. So government needs to be part of that, even though private companies, institutions like SAIC and our partners can play a role in that. But if the opportunities, for example, to do broad mentoring to assist youngsters that are working in these local municipalities, if that is not created by government, we also I fear that we will fall flat again. And lonely engineers in local municipalities are not going to last. We need to find a way to actually let them network and provide them the support that they need.
I think it's always a very interesting point when I work with municipalities. The most important person is the municipal manager, and then there is an engineer who is the one who gets things done. And these people often are the ones who make these places work. And the Auditor General is actually increasingly doing work looking at service implementation, infrastructure building, and these sorts of issues as part of its broader mandate than just audit simply. But we often plug these gaps, Alan, at national level, and the DBSA more broadly than the fund has been very important, right, in terms of project prep in particular, and building a skills base. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that broader role that the bank is playing and how that interfaces with the fund.
Thanks, Peter, for that question. Yes, indeed, the Development Bank has a unit called the Project Preparation Division, and that unit is very specifically mandated to assist spheres of government in preparing projects appropriately. What we have found, certainly in the couple of years that we've been running, is that the projects that are being brought forward by project sponsors, and when I say sponsors, I mean state-owned enterprises, departments, metros, and provinces. When those sponsors bring projects forward for funding, the level of preparation and the level of detail and comprehensive descriptions around business cases are not necessarily what the private sector would like to see, or certainly haven't reached the detail that the private sector would like to see in order to provide an investment into those projects. And the project preparation division is mandated specifically to assist these sponsors in driving project preparation, feasibility studies, cost benefit analyses, and all of the things that go around putting together a business case for a project to the point where they become, as we like to say, bankable. So there is a division. They have a fiscus allocated amount, which hopefully will be topped up on a regular basis, which can be dispersed under the guidance of the division and under the management of the division to these sponsors to prepare projects. And we know that the pipeline of projects going to that division is extensive, and I mean it's across all industries. Marianne will be happy that there are roads and railways in there, and Stephen will be happy that there's a number of water projects in there. There's some power projects, there's agricultural projects, schools, big schools programs, massive clinics, PPP support, are all being looked at by the division. Maybe I should pause there, but I can add to that, Peter. I don't want to use up all of the time that you have, but what I just want to say is that the pipeline of projects that certainly the DBSA considers around the preparation and the funding from the IF's perspective is governed through Infrastructure South Africa. So as those projects get registered by sponsors in Infrastructure South Africa, we then have sight of those. We have a window into that pipeline, and we can support them through preparation or through the blended finance funding that the IF provide. Thanks, Peter.
I wanted to come on and ask you a similar question actually about the institutional setup that's now forming. It is now bedding in, but we've obviously seen the departure of the Minister of Electricity from the infrastructure role. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how that machine, which is a quite complicated machine between the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, ISA, the IIO, all these different acronyms, Infrastructure Fund, is actually working. Is it fulfilling its function, or is it adding complexity?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both, Peter, if I can be honest. I think it is fulfilling its function, and the function there is to consolidate the pipeline of projects, the national pipeline of projects. So we are looking at projects and programs that are large and complex. And certainly it's in the sphere of a minimum size of project is around a billion rand. And if there's a programmatic approach, it's around 3 billion rand. So with that in mind, sponsors then can filter their projects through the ISA, the Infrastructure South Africa process, which involves a registration, an evaluation of that project. They have to produce an early business case, which is along the lines of what Andrew spoke about earlier, the 5-case model approach. It then gets extended to an intermediate business case, which is essentially a pre-feasibility study, bordering on feasibility study level work. That's when the infrastructure fund can get involved, because then there's enough information for us to begin our structuring work and discussions with the broader financing community. And I'm very pleased to hear the number of different instruments and offerings that are available out there. Certainly those are the kinds of conversations we would be looking to have to support these projects. The project is then approved through the Infrastructure Investment Review Committee, which is run out of ISA, and that is chaired by the chairman or the chairperson of ISA, which used to be now Minister Ramakgopa, and there's an acting chairperson at the moment. And then finally approved through the Infrastructure Investment Committee, which is chaired by the Minister of the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. And that once that has occurred, that project then is financed through National Treasury. Within that process, there is an application that goes to National Treasury earlier on, such that the correct allocation and the correct time periods can be assigned to any approved funding that comes from the fiscus. So that's a very, very sort of potted summary of how the process works. but it is working. There are some challenges to the process because you did ask where it may be a bit complex, and some of those challenges are around timing of applications for funding. We only have a single window in the year to put projects through what's known as the budget facility for infrastructure. And that process occurs once a year with some timing around approvals and allocations as well, which match the budget cycle. We're trying to influence the ecosystem in that regard to see if we can open up more windows so that we can get more projects through the cycle with the same capacity that we have now more often. And hopefully that will then also accelerate the number of projects that make it to market.
And
Thanks,
maybe you can
Peter.
just give us a taste of what the projected growth rate you're expecting. Now this institutional setup is sort of bedding in. What sort of growth rate in sort of pass-through of projects and financing should we expect from this mechanism? To put you on the spot with a forecast.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, I mean, there's probably two perspectives you can take on that, Peter. The one is how quickly can projects be prepared and fed through that pipeline process, and the other side of the coin is going to be how quickly or how rapidly can we find the financing to support those projects, because there's no point in having a huge number of projects which we're unable to finance. So it's going to be the speed of financing as well as the speed of preparation that determines how quickly those projects can be implemented. I think what I can say now is that we've probably got about 10 projects which are lined up for financial close process at the moment. The ISA universe of projects is much larger than that, and I think, you know, if I just look at the database of projects that they're currently managing, you're looking at well into the 500 to 750 billion rands worth of projects that are ready to become ready, if I can use that disclaimer or caveat. But also there's a number of those projects which are going to be able to be put to market for private sector and other sort of structuring support outside of the fiscus. So I think if you look at the number of projects that are sort of lining up at the back of the pipeline, you know, if we can support them, the growth can be very, very large, very quickly.
Thank you, Alan. I think a note of optimism there, although you didn't put a number on it. I would just remind what we said at the start. We are sitting a third below in real terms where we were in 2014-15. So the need is obviously huge. As we sort of think about drawing some of these themes of this panel to a close, maybe turning to you, Michelle, first. In terms of that sort of 4 billion allocation you'd like to make and how you can get there, what are some of the things you need to see from the South African government, from the demand side of financing as well, in terms of South African projects, or from asset managers and banks to really unlock that at speed? What's your sort of shopping list of asks?
So I think we need to see the priority projects and have very early discussions, both with the government, with institutions like the BSA, but also with commercial banks who would be ready to work with us on these projects under our guarantee.
Great. That was a short shopping list. Excellent. Thank you. And maybe to Ed, what are the sort of particularly the policy or the leadership factors that you're looking at in the infrastructure space to scale financing, and maybe back to that idea of a competitive market for financing between South Africa and the rest of the continent to allow South Africa to poke its head above the competition somewhat?
That's a good question. I think I think, as I said a little earlier, I think that the infrastructure need is vast right across the continent, but also in South Africa. But the market there is very different. There is a need to raise money in local currency because that's best. So I think the government needs a strategic plan around what it's going to do and make sure the private sector knows what it's trying to do and differentiate between projects that need more state support versus ones that the private sector can do itself. But as long as it creates that enabling environment, then I think it can attract the capital in to finance these projects because it's out there. I mean, Michelle's got £4 billion. There's unlimited amounts from other export credit agencies out there, and also in the bond markets and the bank markets. It's about creating that enabling environment, unlocking the liquidity, and doing it in an affordable way for South Africa. So I think, you know, that's starting to happen, and that, you know, we'll see more of that happening in the near future.
Thank you. I think the point on the plan is interesting. We obviously had the SIDSA conference, I think it was now 4 years ago, highlighting a plan basically from government. Has not been sort of repeated. I think there was some short attention spans as the institutional structure that Alan was laying out was put in place, and maybe we do need a rallying point of another large-scale presidential infrastructure conferences as well, just concentrating on infrastructure, not broader investment like the recent presidential infrastructure investment conference. Rather. Turn to you, Dinesh, in terms of you expanding your interest in South Africa, and maybe the appetite you see from locals to work with an institution like your own. Your model ultimately is taking on risk fundamentally. I was wondering if you just comment maybe on where you see that balance of risk getting worse. There's obviously a general negativity around South Africa versus the opportunities that are available, and how you manage that divergence between risk and opportunity.
Thanks for the question. So, I mean, the risk profile in South Africa debating, it's, you know, our portfolio is emerging markets across the globe. So we're constantly looking at increased risks, but we're not risk averse, we're risk aware, right? We've got a mandate to go in and deliver the infrastructure that's needed, people need it. And the fundamental demand in these markets, and, you know, the growth in populations means that it will be there as long as you're patient and you can structure properly. There are opportunities to be had. So, you know, we've been out of South Africa for quite a while. It was deemed a too developed market by our sponsors, but that's now changed, especially in the context of the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And so we're going in there and we're looking to partner with individuals on the ground, right? Stakeholders who understand the market locally, and then use our expertise that we've had leveraging, you know, across Africa and in Asia to put together structures that really work and, you know, circumvent the usual risk that you see. And that's why we think the private sector is so important to work with, because if we can, you know, there's demand from the private sector, there's demand from the population on the ground. If we can then structure solutions just based around that, matching supply and demand, then we think there are viable projects to be had there. And we're going to try and take that blended finance approach even further. Garanco is looking to do a couple of pilot transactions in the market. But if the demand is there, then we're very happy to look at setting up an onshore credit guarantor to sustainably mobilize the local capital markets and the institutional investors to finance infrastructure. So you have the natural providers of local long-term capital married up with the natural users of natural long-term capital. So you have a completely onshore life cycle there of financing. And by setting up these onshore vehicles, we then, with local co-sponsors, so we would do the development, but we'd want to mobilize local co-equity sponsors. And we'd start it with the local executive team, right? So they would understand fully locally what the challenges are. And we've done this in Nigeria and Pakistan. And by having a local team and local onshore entity, they can provide solutions that we sitting offshore just can't, because we don't understand the market like they do, and they can put together structural solutions using these kind of contingent credit products that they're mandated to do to then try and solve these issues. And I think that's really, we've got to try and facilitate local solutions, and that's what I think what we're trying to do with our capacity. Thanks.
No, I think that's very exciting in local currency in particular. I mean, there's huge untapped or undertapped demand, particularly from local asset managers, who, as I think Stephen said earlier, with the regulation 16 changes now are poked by the regulatory system to invest more into infrastructure, and consultants, etc., thinking a lot, or asset consultants thinking a lot more about that issue now as we move forward. But I think we also highlight that, and I think Michelle's highlighted as well, that there are no need for magic new solutions in South Africa. The experiences are there from elsewhere in the world, and just as the UK is deploying its 5 cases model, is a classic example of that. Just turning then finally to you, Stephen, in terms of where you see us go from here. Maybe you can just give us a little sense of your shopping list of what you'd like to see from government in terms of reforms underlying some faster rollout of infrastructure to close that gap that we've been talking about, and maybe where that leads you to be most excited about the marginal rand of ABSA balance sheets.
Yeah, I think all we want to see is a speed and the agency from government. If that is in place, and decisiveness. And so in some areas we have been, but if you look at EV now, as an example, there is sort of delays. And if you look into at the investment conference, President talked about the visa reforms as well. And so what we want to see is that speed of execution, and and prioritize the projects and say these are the priorities, and we stick with them. We are quite good to when we work under pressure, whether it's World Cup or COVID, and we are able to gather together and prioritize and say these are the things that we need to do. So from government, I think that has been sort of the message. Private sector is here to assist, and so happy with what happened on the energy space. We are quite learned a lot, and I expect on that. I mean, on round 5 out of 23 projects, ABSA financed 21 projects out of those 23 projects. So the expertise that they are building, and what we want to see is the same speed, decisiveness in the water and other social project spaces. Initially, you talked about the PPP. I mean, me and you used to laugh and say, I mean, at National Treasury, that unit has 4 people. And so the projects were taking longer. So if we're saying PPP is the way to go, let's capacitate those areas and be able to move with speed in that space. So there are reforms. As I said, the energy is the most frustrating and sort of wants to cloud other, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, as I talked about telecoms. On the roads infrastructure, we are back now on track with SANRAL projects now that government took the burden of that Gauteng e-tolls. And so things are definitely happening. Summits of this nature and discussions of this nature will just take us forward. If I listen to Andrew, then many times it's going to be in South Africa. It's exciting. Now we have the Hive Energy project, which we're also looking into it. So I only see light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think, thank you to all my panel. We've had a great discussion. We haven't got derailed by load shedding, literally and in terms of topic. I found often my meetings at the moment is all we talk about is blackouts and load shedding. And we've heard very much there is a much broader, richer infrastructure space, including water, transport and logistics, and also the social side of infrastructure as well. I think it's important to remember we're not just talking about energy as important as it is. I think we've heard very much about de-risking and how people like PIDG and UK Export Finance are very interested to get involved as the infrastructure demand is very much there, and that the business case is very much there. But also we go into some of the details on institutional structure with Alan, and also some of the underlying problems and solutions with Marianne, as well as the banking perspective from Stephen and from Ed. So I want to really thank all my panel. I think it was a very interesting discussion. Hopefully we found some solutions, not just problems, as often can be a South African issue with panels, but I think we found a lot of solutions, which hopefully gives a little nugget of optimism on the infrastructure story. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to all.
We've got our panel online, we've got our panel in person, and we've got nearly everybody seated. Thank you very much. This is the last panel debate, and then we have two very, very short talks at the end of this, and then we've got social time together. So thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. This panel is going to be covering a very different topic to what we did earlier. The value of what we discussed earlier was around the money and the enabling factor. What we're looking at this time is actually the different projects, the different industries, and the more practical aspects of infrastructure rather than the finance of infrastructure, which we've done before. So we'll be covering with our panel, which will be Andrew Sulu, you've met, Chris Green from Hogan Lovells, Chris Bitz from AECOM, Lufano Rutsiku from SACP and more, CMP, Malusi Shezi from CETA. So thank you very much for my panel for being present, and thank you all for taking your seats. I appreciate it. What we've learned, what we're going to be experiencing now as sort of a high level introduction to the kinds of topics that the panel's capabilities and expertise is going to share is around UK funds and investment and incentives. We're going to be looking at life from a regulatory legal perspective. We're going to be looking at global comparisons of South Africa in various sectors. We're going to be looking at the impact of the energy elephant, and we'll be looking at project management and leadership, and we'll be looking at skills and capacity. So those are the kind of things we'll look at, and it'll be in various different sectors. One of the things I took away from the earlier session was there are many steps in a process of an infrastructure development project. As one can imagine, you don't put a dam up in 5 minutes, and the water will kill you anyway if you tried. Things take time, and then they take double more time than what you expect. It's like any IT project. Take the project, double it, and double it again. There's finance, which is there. It has its place, but it still needs to be unlocked so that that capital can be used in an effective manner. And then we have the delivery aspect, which is a complexity in any project to make sure that it delivers effectively. So what I found interesting is there's 750 billion rand in the wings waiting to be let loose on projects. So I think the project management aspect is our next focus that we're going to need to get to. So Andrew, can we start maybe with you? What I wanted to understand, just picking up from where you started earlier today, is the key positives you took out of a recent conversation you referenced on infrastructure. You talked about there were some government to government conversations, industry to industry conversations, public sector, private sector conversations. What do you think are the key positives for South Africa that came out of that engagement?
Thank you, Sharon. I think there is a great synthesis of some serious expertise. I mean, South Africa has wonderful expertise in many areas as well, and in areas that the UK doesn't have. But the UK does have globally leading project management skills. It's just an area of our economy we are blessed with quite a range of sort of leading global firms, and a lot of infrastructure projects are technically complex. There are governance issues around them, and governments all over the world want to make sure that delivery happens on budget, on time, if at all possible. And I would say, I mean, it's funny, in both my visits to Mauritius and South Africa last month, there was some conversation about, elections next year, I think everything will slow down. But as someone who also hopes to be re-elected next year, I think I'm the only elected representative in the room, I'd say no, not at all. Actually, us politicians, we're very simple folk. We like pointing to shiny new projects on the ground that we've delivered. So this is the time to speed up and get things done, in my view. And, there's an election in South Africa next year, just as there's going to be one probably in the autumn here in the UK. So I think, big need, a lot of expertise, political imperative to deliver. That's a great combination, isn't it?
I love the positivity. Isn't it wonderful and infectious? It's fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. There's the dichotomy that you have in the just energy transition of there has to go from a carbon coal environment, and we need to get to a renewable environment, but we can't do that in a short period of time for all the reasons we talked about a moment ago. Even renewables don't necessarily come online as quickly as we want them to. And how does that align to the Paris Accord and the expectations of global investors that there is this just energy requirement?
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for having me. As is usual in my world, the financiers have stolen all our thunder already, so there's not a huge amount left to say. But I mean, yeah, Sharon, it's an interesting dichotomy that I think Africa, excuse me, Africa in particular is grappling with. There is a global imperative to transition from an energy perspective, but I think if I'm not mistaken, on an overall basis, Africa as a continent is still more than probably 90% reliant on fossil fuels and traditional energy sources. So there's obviously a huge lead time and a huge cost associated with that transition. I think from a positive perspective, there's also a huge need for infrastructure investment to make that happen. I think some of the challenges that we face is that, you know, all stakeholders in that value chain are facing their own imperatives, their own pressures, and we see increasingly funders shying away from funding projects which touch on carbon, fossil fuels, and things like that. And you know, when we talk about the natural tension in the just energy transition, I think that is one of the critical components that we're going to need to deal with. Is how do we make funding available on a sustainable basis to African jurisdictions and African markets who face these pressures to develop these projects, acknowledging that is often going to touch on the fossil fuel and the carbon sector. And I think that there's a lot of work and a lot of thinking that needs to be done in the background by a lot of the big global funders and how we're going to approach that.
Thank you, Chris. As we can see, this 25 odd years ahead of us are going to offer Africa various aspects of different challenges. But talking about projects that have worked extremely well, Chris Brits, I'm going to turn to you in a moment. But as we know, the perfect storm or the pressure or the burning platform or those kind of challenges, COVID, it being one big example we've all had to deal with, how suddenly we've actually been in a position where we can get stuff done. And amazing how we can shorten timelines, be agile, be resilient, be deliverables, how we can actually make things happen. And we've seen a country do it. And Chris Brits was sharing with me earlier some of the really amazing successes coming out of the football demand for the World Cup and out of the COVID demand. So Lefano, the area that we've been talking about together is the elephant in the room, the impact energy is having on every aspect of business. And you were talking about how that is impacting exports, how it's impacting business, how therefore it's impacting our balance of payments, our economy, and therefore the attitude the world has got to us. So from the point of view that you've seen it, where do you see those things manifesting truly as being challenges to business?
Sure. Thanks. I did consider a lot of points that were vented by the previous panel, and I'll try my best as much as I've got temptation to also indulge on some of those points, but avoid repetition by all means. In the South African context, it has been seen that investors have been grappling with maintaining their appetite to invest in the infrastructure environment of South Africa, primarily because for infrastructure to be delivered, electricity and energy on its own becomes an enabler. And currently the flow and the ease of executing those projects without disruption is not promised and committed to anyone. So the impact hits directly in the sense that if business is hesitant to implement, the pace of employment then suffers, among other things. And the availability of energy on its own, if you speak about the mining industry, you can imagine there is very less you can do under the ground, except that you'll have to run a very light provision to just keep the light. But if you're not able to drill on the ground, you can't do anything. If you're not able to run the machines to excavate, you can't build infrastructure, even on the road surfaces and even in the buildings. So energy is having a huge impact on business, on the economy, and ultimately the professionals that are there to participate in executing the projects also suffer because they have to claim work done. And work done to a large extent is enabled by the availability of power.
Thank you very much. Chris, we were talking about the successful infrastructure activities that have occurred in South Africa. Can you share with us some of those and why you believe those were as successful as they were?
Well, yeah, when we had our discussion, I mentioned that a huge amount of infrastructure was provided in the run-up to the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. And the infrastructure that was provided was an array of, whether it's roads, specifically the upgrade of the rail systems, and then also the Gautrain Rapid Rail that was built in the Gauteng province that linked the international airport to Johannesburg. Now, I was privileged to be, for example, part of that project. I mean, it was conceptualized in 1999, and it was developed, or the first part of that, the airport link, was developed in 10 years and became operational just before the World Cup, and the other parts of the system 2 years later. However, in my view, there were a couple of things that drove this. The first was focus, and a common focus, if I can call it that. And unfortunately, I think subsequent to that, well, perhaps just if I may interrupt myself, the political term is for 4 years, whereas any major infrastructure project, such as building a rail system, takes much longer than that. So there needs to be commitment beyond a political term to be able for such a project to realize. The second one was that the Gautrain Management Agency that was responsible for developing this rapid rail system appointed a very strong project management office that assisted government with the rollout and development of this. And there are various other examples as well. What I could perhaps also just mention is just talking about infrastructure and the infrastructure needs. Given my transportation background, I was privileged to be part of a 25-year transport master plan that was developed for the Gauteng province, which is the economic hub of South Africa. And it's also the biggest global city region in the country. Now, just to give an idea, when we did the master plan, the Gauteng population was around 12 million people. There were estimates that the Gauteng population would grow over 25 years to 18 million. In other words, a 50% growth in the population due to firstly urbanization, but secondly also migration from the rest of Africa. And that puts huge, that type of population growth. And if you can't grow your economy at the same rate as your population, you're going backwards. And that puts huge pressure on the infrastructure. Now, at that point, our assessment was that the travel speed on the sort of primary and secondary transport network was around 40 kilometers an hour. We also then modeled the network with various scenarios. And the first one was the sort of business as usual scenario. Now, the business of as usual scenario for 25 years showed that the travel speed would reduce to below 10 kilometers an hour. Now, I mean, that's a disaster. So it means that over and above the sort of business as usual scenario, there was a need for major investment in transport infrastructure. That's road infrastructure, primary road infrastructure, but also investment in rail, in other transit, and so on. Which unfortunately has not happened since, or to a very significant extent, has not happened post, let's call it 2012, 2013, when the country was on a very good growth trajectory, and perhaps, but so just, I know I'm talking a lot, but I think we've proven that we can deliver major infrastructure projects, that there is the capacity. However, there needs to be the focus, the will, and the policy certainty to get this done. And I can expand on a number of other things, but perhaps not to talk too much at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Malusi, are you with us?
Yes, Chair.
Lovely. Thank you very much, sir. You are the lead at CETA. Please tell us who CETA is, why you're important, and what is your contribution in the infrastructure place for South Africa?
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon to those online in South Africa, and good morning to those in the CETA is full name is called Construction Education and Training Authority. We are established by the Skills Development Act of 1998 in South Africa to provide skills development services to the construction industry or sector. That's basically what we exist to do. Most stakeholders will be aware that you pay your 1% from your payroll called Skills Development Levy. We are funded from a skills development levy to make sure that the sector has necessary skills that it needs to be competitive and also to be economically sustainable. Our major role and contribution to infrastructure, as most will recall, that after all these projects have been approved and the funding has been secured, the next critical stage is any infrastructure development start with a construction activity. For us is to make sure that those critical and scarce skills that are needed to enable the development of infrastructure in this country are available, both for those that are still yet to enter the job market and those that are already in the workforce. They need to be reskilled, as also we know that there are significant changes in the skills arena, and also from a construction perspective, all these new forms of development, like your green technologies, etc., they need new set of skills to be available, so that the investment that is made into any form of infrastructure also is realized, that at the end of the day as well, to maintain that same infrastructure, so that we can deal with the issues that we are facing as a country in an extent that there's been a very low investment on the side of infrastructure, and also the one that we had is dilapidated and it needs because of poor maintenance. So on our side, what we focus on is to make sure that we use the funds available. We partner with also other organizations on the same journey. We fund candidacies for the professionals. We fund for learnerships, apprenticeships, etc., to make sure that the industry got the skills it needs. And for us as well, we're supporting the ERRP as it is indicated in the same document as was mentioned by the panelists in panel 1, whereby skills development is viewed as enabler number 6, and that's where we play our role in the main to ignite economic development through the skills provision. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Malusi. Appreciate that. Andrew, as we are hearing, there's a lot to do. We also hear there's a huge willingness from the UK government. What, in practical terms, can the UK government do with whom to enable and get more of these projects into the wings and moving through these 7 steps that we need to get through first so that they can be delivered?
Just carrying on the really important skills, please, and it's great to have CETA represented here. We have twinning projects between United Kingdom further education colleges and South African TVET colleges, and that's primarily through the work of the British Council. I visited Northlink College in Cape Town, for example, on one of my visits to see the benefits of that. And a message that I sort of relay all the time to British business, the British Chamber of Commerce in South Africa, is I hope part of the UK offer will be an increase in skills provision. And I think that is generally something that we do have quite a good record on. And I would like that to be, one of the hallmarks, because no economy around the world is going to get this infrastructure completed, without a workforce with the adequate skills. There is a good UK financing offer. I heard just at the start of the last seminar, I think it was Peter saying, there isn't a shortage of money. With another hat I wear as a trustee of a £10 billion endowment fund for the Church of England here in the UK. I sit on the assets committee for that, and my take is there is no shortage of money for good investable projects, particularly in the green and the renewable space. I mean, there is just not a shortage of money. So I think that there's a UKEF offer, there's British International Investment. So there is quite a powerful financing officer. I talked briefly in my opening remarks as well about the funds under management of the City of London, and my personal sort of hope and wish that we get more of those into the global infrastructure space, of which South Africa would be a beneficiary. And then obviously project management, building information, modeling, using the 5-case model, and so on. So I would say sort of skills, expertise, some of the technical processes, funding, and skills being sort of a key part of the offer as well.
Very interesting, because that's quite a number of pillars that we've got to deal with. But just delving a little further into that conversation, we can all talk about things. We can have conferences, we can have seminars, we can have workshops. How do we actually get things physically moving from an interest point of view? There's money, there's capital, we know it's there. How do we get it into action?
Well, as a politician, I would say political will is a very precious commodity. So there has to be a clear directive from the top that these projects need to be delivered. I'm absolutely sensing that is the case in South Africa, from the president, from the presidency, certainly from Minister Sile Zikalala, who I had the pleasure and the honor to meet again with last month. And actually, as I said before, I think the election next year is an added spur to get things done. So I think you need the political leadership of the government to say, yes, we've got to move this forward. And I think that is that. So that is a positive. And I think good project management cannot be underestimated. I think governance is an important area of that as well, sometimes overlooked. And as I say, infrastructure, the UK Infrastructure and Projects Authority are back with the officials at Infrastructure South Africa and Department of Public Works and Infrastructure at the end of this month. And I think time is of the essence in all our economies, sort of post-COVID. This is critical to it's the big flywheel, if you like, isn't it, that's going to drive economic growth across the economy. So I'm confidently expecting actually more projects to be announced and a steady sort of pipeline of those to be rolled out over the next few months.
And I mean, I think political will is the key point, and you know, just to tie a couple of points that I've been listening to together, I think the way that, you know, essentially political will manifests itself in the local market is through a stable and appropriate regulatory environment when it comes to a lot of the infrastructure development that we're talking about. And I think to Chris's earlier point around, other Chris's earlier point around some of the more successful infrastructure delivery that South Africa as a market has seen in the last, you know, decade and a half. I think if you look at it quite carefully, what a lot of that successful infrastructure delivery had in common was a bespoke and well thought through policy and regulatory enabling environment. And that speaks to things like the World Cup infrastructure delivery, Gautrain infrastructure delivery, and the like. And I think that you can see quite quickly how appropriate regulatory environment from a government and a political perspective leads to quite rapid enhancements in infrastructure development. And you know, the previous panel spoke quite a lot about the reform that has taken place in South Africa already in relation to renewable energy and the infrastructure projects involved in that sector. And to the extent that we can kind of drive and develop that same regulatory reform and certainty, I think, you know, with the political will and you know, that certainly becomes key for international investors. They want to see that certainty and have that policy framework in place before making investment decisions.
Just to pick up on that point further, Chris, as in Chris Green, you were talking about the fact that South Africa has regulatory wise been a little ahead of some of the rest of Africa in the changes it's making. One of the things you just referred to now that I picked up on is it's bespoke regulation for a specific need. There also has been, for example, the changes in our energy regulations where people can now generate more power. We heard some numbers on that earlier. What sort of things on the regulatory space do you think the government should be looking at now to make the next level of difference?
Thanks, Sharon. I mean, I think when you and I spoke, what we spent a little bit of time talking about is that if you look at a large number of African jurisdictions, I think what you find is often there's an absence of, if you're talking specifically about the energy sector and the transition towards renewable energy, there's an absence of a bespoke regulatory regime for renewable energy. Energy in a number of these jurisdictions continues to be regulated on a fairly homogeneous basis, and the starting point for that regulation in a lot of these jurisdictions is a historical state monopoly on conventional energy. And what you struggle with when you're trying to drive energy infrastructure projects is to fit those projects, you know, squarely into that regulatory environment. I mean, I suppose if you look at some of the most obvious examples, going back again to what you referred to that was discussed on the previous panel, until not so long ago, the licensing threshold on renewable independent projects in South Africa was 1 megawatt. You know, a couple of years ago, we saw that change to 100 megawatts. And, you know, almost overnight, we saw a number of projects in the energy space being implemented particularly in the mining space, where mines were bringing on board, you know, closer to utility scale renewable projects. And you know, I think that the change that drove quite quickly then resulted in that licensing threshold for independent power projects being removed altogether. And I think we'll continue to see, you know, significant investment in that space, particularly by the mines and heavy industry in South Africa to make them less reliant on the national grid. To be more specific in other industry sectors, I think it's a bit harder to say. I mean, again, I think the previous panel referred to some of the reforms that are, you know, potentially in the pipeline with respect to our PPPs. And I think when it comes to road, rail, and port infrastructure, those sorts of reforms are going to be important. I think there's also going to need to be, again, we've spoken about how, you know, some sectors across the continent are historically subject to some homogeneous regulation. Again, I think increasingly there needs to be a realization from the international community when it comes to projects in Africa, and you know, South Africa is no different in this regard. I think Africa, there's still sometimes a view of Africa as a bit of a homogeneous society, And there needs to be a realization these jurisdictions are different. Different countries do things in different ways. The regulation environments are different. And there's a need for kind of detailed due diligence, detailed understanding and nuanced understanding in each market. But similarly, that understanding needs to go both ways, and markets that are looking for infrastructure investment need to tailor their regulation environments accordingly as well.
Thanks, Chris. I think regulation, as we all know, is an enabler and a barrier at times. Mufano, just carrying on the subject that Andrew brought up a moment ago around governance, around projects and project management. I know this is something that you get quite excited about, ensuring that there's strategy planning, costing, delivery, and making sure these happen. And you've talked about the importance of tightening up leadership and dealing with waste within projects. Could you give us some further information other than just the key words I've pulled out?
Yeah, thanks again, Chair. I think the leading word it's governance, as stated by the latter speaker there. The governance around project management, and I can refer to it as project controls. And let me take an extract from the aspiration of the National Development Plan of South Africa. It speaks about building a capable state. Now, I want to lift that down to project management, because when you build a capable state, you must build a state that is able to execute projects that are from an investment perspective. So when money is put in the hands of the president, and the president hands over the money to treasury to disperse into infrastructure execution, it must find technically capable people to deliver. Otherwise, it ultimately all would mean nothing, because that money will go back without serving the intended purpose. So the control around cost, the control around time management is quite important. And what does it mean? If you borrow money and you're supposed to execute a project in 36 months and you don't execute it, you shall have incurred interests without achieving the intended purpose. Therefore, it's very important to link the availability and the capabilities of skills with the investment that is put down. So if you don't ultimately finish the projects on time, money returns, penalties come in some instances. For example, in the energy environment, you've got an element or a clause called deemed energy charges, which means that if you're supposed to connect a certain customer that has applied for energy provision, when the date passes without that customer receiving power from you, they start charging you deemed energy charges. What is the result of that? Is the incapability to execute within budget, to execute within technical specifications, to execute within project schedules. So I think the emphasis on technical capabilities and controls is not much more as investments. And there's a need to balance and synchronize the two, because in South Africa, I would argue that we don't necessarily have a project, we don't necessarily have a problem of lack of investments. We've got the problem of executing when investors have put money on the ground. And ultimately, we kill their appetite for the next investment. So I'm speaking about three aspects. The government, stakeholders involved in infrastructure development needs to make sure that skills, capable individuals know how to execute a project within the spec, within the cost, and within the time, so that ultimately we save the investors' funds and use them for relevant purposes.
Thank you. And delivering on all those pillars gives a higher appetite, a lower risk profile, and a greater energy to, as you said, the next project. Malusi, if we could just turn to you, we're talking about project management and the importance of project management to actually give us an outcome delivery according to the strategy, the plan, and the costing. In your area on training, to what extent is project management one of your pillars of education?
It is part of our sector skills plan from which we derive the programs we run, specifically by virtue that project management and construction management is one of the critical skills currently that we are short of in the country. We're funding that through the candidacy, whereby we give bursaries to those that are still at tertiary, and then once they have completed the academic program, when they are placed at the workplace, we make sure that that company that is enrolling them got sufficient mentors and work that is currently ongoing for their practical work exposure. And we support them through mentorship as well for them to pass exams. At the moment, the programs that we run, we're not getting much traction in terms of project management, in terms of people qualifying, but there are many candidates in the system. So the investment is still ongoing at this stage, and we are looking forward to a point whereby in the country, the construction companies and investors won't need to have to import the skills into this country in the next 5 years, because the pipeline is enough to service what is in the pipeline of projects that are envisaged to be started. But we are at this point in time having the funds, we are having support programs. We have started to engage the councils themselves, including Mr. Lufuno here's council, to make sure that we collaborate so that we can be able to use our mass to achieve greater results from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Very positive. And I think many of us in the room, me particularly, wish we had had opportunities of these nature as a youngster, and the vast broadness of opportunity that youngsters have today and the various ways in which they can achieve training and education. Maybe if I come back to you, Andrew, on this one, it's the area around job creation within South Africa. Obviously, the UK, it's within Africa and South Africa. How do you go about in your projects estimating? We heard about the percentage minimum that you usually have under most conditions. Is there conditions attached, value add towards job creation and utilizing anything down to SMMEs even in the environment, or is that too risky?
Job creation is absolutely key, and I think British businesses do have a good track record of creating domestic South African employment in projects which we've been involved with in the past. I'd take an example. For example, Alexander Dennis, a big bus manufacturer in the UK, have partnered with the African Genome Automotive, slightly unusual name. I met the very dynamic managing director of that last month. So you have a major bus factory being built just outside Durban. And the IP for that, but for those buses, some of which will be electric buses as well, remains in the UK. But the jobs, in terms of manufacturing, will be added to the significant South African automotive cluster. So that will be one good example. I've mentioned the Hive Energy project and the Copper Special Economic Zone. I mean, that is a huge project, sort of billions and billions of US dollars sort of going into that, financial close coming up very soon for that presidentially gazetted project. So I absolutely get the significant need for job creation, but I guess if you look at everything that has to be done, if you look at the skills pipeline which is needed as well, one could perhaps dare to hope for a time when there will be, competitive demand, for skills, and South Africans will have a good range of, well-paying job opportunities to apply for. So, infrastructure, I think I referred to it earlier as being the big sort of flywheel of the economy, and I think it does have so many other spin-offs. You take the bridges in rural areas. I mean, if you can suddenly, people can get to a health clinic to get well, they can get to a school to get educated, to learn construction skills. If you can get goods to market, I mean, that bridge going down, okay, there are jobs on the bridge, but suddenly you've created a whole sort of local economic ecosystem locally of all sorts of things which are capable. So it's a small example, and we mustn't forget the rural areas as well and just concentrate on the big municipalities. But I think there are just so many stories like that one could illustrate from all sorts of different investments.
I mean, I think to Andrew's point, there was a recent, if I'm not mistaken, there was a recent World Bank study just on the other side of that, which shows the cost of not having that in place. And I think that the World Bank estimated in sub-Saharan Africa, on a national basis, infrastructure constraints and impediments and the lack of infrastructure is costing each of those economies 2% annually. And I think that they, in the same report, estimated that on an annual basis for going forward for the next 10 years, sub-Saharan Africa requires, I think it was almost $100 billion in investment annually, 60 billion of that being on new infrastructure. And there's currently, I think, 25 billion. So I think that just shows, Andrew, your point that when you do have that and when we do have it, the kind of benefits flow directly from that. So, I mean, for me, that's a point well made, that infrastructure is the flywheel, I think, that keeps everything else going.
Thank you. And thank you for the additional insight there, Chris. I'm going to stay with you, Chris, for a moment. You talk about one of the major exports of South Africa being mining output, whether it's raw material or a process to a point. And that South Africa is currently exporting something equivalent to what it was doing in 1994. Now, I don't know if you have exchange rate leveled that or not, but either way, if you don't exchange rate level it, it's even worse, because the exchange rate has definitely changed more than a huge amount since 1994. So if we look at the mining industry, what do you feel is the investment needed to make a change in the mining industry? And it can't only be energy. There must be other areas that they should be looking at. And I know many mines, and I've heard the likes of Anglo and people like that saying they're going to be off-grid completely by 2025 or whatever date it is. So what else must they be doing? And maybe there are other things in energy as well.
Yeah, Sharon, thanks. I mean, and I think obviously South Africa has suffered a decline in mining output. I think as of April, the latest statistic was that we'd had 13 consecutive months of reduced mining output, which, for what is historically a resources-based economy is obviously problematic. Energy and ongoing load shedding, and certainly not to kind of drag us down that path too badly, but I mean, it's obviously a constraint when you have energy intensive industries like mining, and you have the kind of stage 6 load shedding, which we have at the moment. Obviously there's a massive impact on industry, but it's certainly not, our infrastructure constraints are not limited to energy. Our ports and rail and road networks need significant upgrade. And those are, to my mind, almost equal impediments at the moment to mining export, as what energy is. In terms of, I'm sure most of you in the room at some point in the last little while have driven down the N3 between Johannesburg and Durban. And I mean, you can drive past, kilometers of trucks. And that just, to me, is a visual manifestation of, the lacking rail infrastructure. Most of what's on that road should be on rail. So I think, again, and this is going to take a lot of, in the broader sense, this is going to take a lot of public-private partnership in South Africa to certainly improve and develop new road, rail, and port infrastructure. And I think if we can get that right in conjunction with the energy, obviously, as we discussed right at the beginning, I think the South African mining sector continues and will for some time continue to be a vitally important part of the economy. Again, obviously that will entail a shift away from historical fossil fuels and traditional energy sources. But again, South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are some of the biggest sources globally of battery metals and things that are going to be needed in the energy transition. So mining, one way or another, is going to stay an important part of those economies.
And also a very high employer as well, which is important for the country too. Chris Brits, if I could just have a quick question with yourself. Chris, I'm going to assume you're going to join us while I start talking. In the company that you are working for, there's you're in many, just about around the world in most countries, and you see a different degree of skills in the infrastructure space in different parts of the world. And we laughingly had a discussion around how many of those are South Africans that have gone into the world. But where can South Africa make changes so that we can improve our relationships, our partnerships, and our deliveries?
Yeah, so I mean, just by way of example, I mean, we are a global company, and that provides our engineers an opportunity to work on projects right across the globe. And I mean, our experience has been that we don't have to stand back in terms of our expertise, and there are quite a number of the large consultancies in South Africa that do contribute to projects throughout the world. The thing, so in the private sector, the quality of skills and the capacity is good. The issue perhaps is around the public sector, that's where the capacity is not always at the level that it should be. And I think Marianne also referred to that, and perhaps more so at a local level than at a provincial or national level, to deliver projects. Now, about 10 years ago, there was a scheme where retired engineers were sort of allocated to municipalities to assist in creating additional capacity. Now, and that was a scheme that you know, it was a type of a public-private partnership in a way, where the private sector assisted in providing support to the public sector and government, well, municipalities specifically, to create additional capacity and to transfer skills to enable more efficient delivery of projects. Now, and that has in many instances rendered some good results in more efficient delivery of infrastructure, and specific, perhaps more social infrastructure than economic infrastructure, but be it as it may. I mean, that was also discussed earlier. There's a huge need for the further development of social infrastructure and to provide the population with basic services.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the insights. Bifana, I'm going to ask you a really awkward question. How long's a piece of string is the translation of my question. When do you think South Africa will be in a position that at an infrastructure level, it has addressed the key challenges to unlock investment and unlock delivery?
Yeah, indeed, you've defined your question well. It's controversial. I think one, we need to, so let's look at where infrastructure development accountability sits. One, at a political level. Second, at a delivery level. So when you set up the structures that are leading at political level and leading infrastructure development matters, people must be technically inclined as much as they are politically inclined. Why is that necessary? The value chain needs to be understood from the beginning to the end. There is not much time to be making a politician appreciate the context and the importance of delivering projects on time, right? The next thing is that the layer of communities that are involved where the infrastructure is being developed must appreciate and understand the necessity in the context of how do they support these projects to see the light of the day in terms of time discipline for execution. You cannot be empowering a community with a clinic and the community is disrupting the success of project from an implementation perspective. It's self-defeating, right? You cannot be empowering the community with road infrastructure and they do not want to see that coming to the end. So the collaboration and integration of project implementers and the beneficiaries is quite important, because there's no project that will address the entire backlog of jobs in one community. At the end of the day, they must appreciate that they will have a piece of participation, and they must also have a piece of appreciation that they allow the project to be completed and be handed over. So I think my response is collaboration on different levels of stakeholders that are participating in the project.
Thank you, and a good answer to a difficult question. My penultimate question to you, Malusi, is we've talked about project management skills. To what degree is there education through what you are doing or that you're aware of elsewhere in the country to become alive to non-corrupt behavior, good governance, doing the right thing for our businesses, looking at a sustainable company, a sustainable country? To what extent is that taught in your environment?
Thank you. I believe that professionals and councils have realized the importance of ethics. I'll answer for this question from that perspective. Universities themselves and universities of technologies which train people that will enter the professions and be employed by companies, will either be consulting or engineering or construction companies, they got the sense and they are appreciative of the importance of ethics and having ethical people in the space. The councils, they got code of conduct that governs the conduct of the professionals that they enroll from the time they are still writing exams until when they are certified, when they qualify and get a practice number. Ethics is part of that journey. However, it is important also to note that the councils and the universities or academic institution can play their role as much as, but it's an individual call, depending what your values are as well, to make sure that you behave ethically, because what we have, even the project failures in the country and the challenges we're having even with the energy at the moment, they talk to some extent to the lack of ethics. So we understand that the universities have made sure that the curriculum, especially towards the end of the academic training, that learners and students are exposed to that. From our side, on our programs that we run, we've taken a resolution as well that will be including things like entrepreneurship and also the issue of ethics for everyone that we are supporting, meaning those that we fund under our candidacy program. Everyone now going forward, starting this year, will be attending as part of that. If their council is not giving them any support, the ethics course as well as part of the training. Thank you.
The Corporate Governance Code King 4 and its requirements for ethics is starting to filter into business, which is very rewarding to see. And that is something that it's known to be one of the best corporate governance codes in the world. So it's good to see that that is being educated through. The last thing I just want to comment on, there have been a couple of questions that have come through from the floor, and I'm going to summarize them because they all have a fairly common theme. And Chris, I'm going to turn to you first and put you in the difficult position, and anybody else may choose to answer after that. Load shedding is potentially turning into blackouts. Corruption is not over. It still has its play. Why? Where is it that we have a place to feel positive? We have to address the elephant in the room, and then we're going to turn to a positive statement at the end of that. But we can't ignore that there are these challenges. And what do you think business can do, and particularly in infrastructure, what can be done?
Sharon, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult question, right? And you and I attended a seminar in South Africa a couple of months ago, hosted at Gibbs, where we had a long session on business ethics. And our firm actually hosted another session last week in Frankfurt, talking about, you know, the positives and negatives of Africa and doing business on the continent. And I think, again, as you said, there are we spend, I think, quite a lot of time focusing on the challenges that we face. In a South African context, we spend a lot of time focused on load shedding and corruption, and you can't get away from these things. Load shedding is a daily practical reality that South Africans face in their personal lives and at work. And you can't in any of these discussions pretend that these things don't exist. By the same token, corruption in our society still exists. It takes a very different form to what it did in previous years. If anything, I think it's and listening to people like Paul Pretorius, who led the evidence at the Zondo Commission in South Africa, listening to Paul talk about it, in his view, what we've done is we've driven things more underground and in some ways made them a little bit more seditious. But again, I think all of that being said, we've spoken about political will. I do think that there is political will at the highest level in South Africa to turn these things around. None of these are problems that can be fixed overnight. But again, what the seminar that you and I spent a lot of time together at in South Africa focused on was the need for close collaboration between business and government. Business, I think the days of business sitting by in South Africa, pointing fingers at government and saying, government must fix these things and must resolve these issues and we'll then come to the table. I think those days are over. I think business needs to understand that it's part and parcel of the solution and needs to be part and parcel of the solution. Quite what form that takes, I think if I had that solution, I would probably be doing something else. But again, it's a difficult question. But I think for me, the starting point is really a deep recognition on the part of business that it's a collaborative approach and business bears equal responsibility to government.
On that positive note, I'm actually going to close the panel debate part of the session because you very competently switched a difficult question, a negative question, into a very positive statement. So thank you very much. I'm not going to stand up and go up to the podium, but I'm now going to just have the last few closing remarks, please, from two of our guests who are members of the chamber. Philip Marsh from Knowledge Mentoring, who's going to speak to us about education and professional development within the infrastructure space.
Infrastructure is the backbone of any society. I said that exactly the same words here 2.5 months ago. So just some very quick background so you understand how I understand the space. I'm a professional engineer in South Africa. I'm a chartered civil and structural engineer, and I've spent 4 decades in this space. I've spent 12 years doing pro bono work on the South African Institution of Civil Engineers. So Professor Marianne van der Skeren is a very good friend of mine. I have these wonderful new colleagues in terms of Malusi Shezi from CETA. His predecessor, Sabelo Waza, was a good friend of mine. A very friend is Mr. Lefuno Ratsiku, who heads the SACPCMP. And Chris Brits was one of our early mentors. We've been mentoring in ACOM, a global leader, for 15 years. So we know this space. And through my work after 2010, 2012, the euphoria of the Soccer World Cup, I was involved with a lot of people, government right down, looking at the National Development Plan, Trevor Manuel's National Development Plan, which was going to be the panacea for South Africa to rocket into stardom. And it was a very positive time. We'd built the Gautrain just on time, days before. We'd got the stadiums up. We had a very successful Soccer World Cup. Looked at scarce and critical skills across the built environment, and just in the civil engineering space, not in the other engineering space, just in civil engineering and project management space, we identified 150 scarce and critical skills that would be needed just to build the National Development Plan. And without going into too much detail, spent a lot of time trying to make it happen in South Africa. And it's very, very difficult to make those sort of things happen in South Africa because of party politics and competitiveness between the different bodies and things like that. So we upped sticks and we moved here 3 years ago, and we've been putting together a program called Maselulokani, which is a Zulu word that means let's advise each other. Let's all guide each other. And it's a collaborative mentoring space. And on this very stage, Sharon, who was the opening person, we welcome Dr. Francisca Botma, who's the head of regulatory services for the Engineering Council of South Africa. And she gave these very frightening statistics. Minister, this is the reality of it. Just to stand still, South Africa needs 155,000 registered professionals. That's no growth and development. That's just to put maintenance into standing still in South Africa. There are only 53,000 registered engineers on the EXA database, the Engineering Council of South Africa database. They don't know where the other 102,000 are. They've left the profession, or they're doing things which are deemed not to be engineering work, but they're in engineering positions. Of that, 18,000 are over 60 years old and are about to retire. The average retirement will be within 2 years. 18,000 professionals out of the 53 active will be gone. 11,000 of the 53,000 are young graduates and candidates with more than 5 years of work experience. They should have registered 2 years earlier. They have got no chance of registering because they have no mentorship and they have no work. These are young engineers that have qualified, or technologists or technicians or project managers or architects or quantity surveyors that are working in the municipalities, the Department of Health, zero access to mentoring, zero access to meaningful work. And everyone says we can't do something. So we saw that you can do something. That's why we're here. The Council for the Built Environment in South Africa used to consist of 6 major professional bodies. There's a couple coming in, but essentially about 10 professional bodies, which include the natural scientists, the surveyors, the town planners, and et cetera, et cetera. And the challenge is that those numbers I've told you about engineers alone are across all those bodies. We estimate there's 300,000 young graduates in South Africa that will never register as professionals. Now that is the future. That's the missing future. All of this investment stuff, all of the money stuff will come to naught because you'll have to import expertise. And so the urgency of that is to start right now. And here comes the real punch. It was meant to be 2024, but in 2025, a new law is being passed to stop all the failures of the many projects because of the unskilled workers. The identification of engineering work will become law in South Africa, which will bring the municipalities and government and all the utilities to a standstill. They will not be able to do engineering work because it'll be illegal. We have to do something. This is a national disaster in the making. So Masilo Lokani, just very quickly, I'll finish. There's no way there are not enough mentors. There's not enough money in South Africa. If we had to do just 1,000 graduates, would take the whole of Mr. Shezi's budget. The CETA can't fund it. National Treasury can't fund it. EWCETA can't fund it. MoCETA can't fund it. The IDC can't fund it. All collectively, they can't fund the need. This is massive. It has to happen at an international level, which is why we are here in the UK doing it, why we've got the institutional structural engineers, civil engineers, we've got all the major bodies in the UK. We're going to be connecting UK expertise, sir. We're going to be connecting in diaspora that's left the South Africa, the brain drain that's left in 30 years. We're connecting it through a technology platform we've developed over the last 3 years, and we're connecting it into the graduates. We've got 8 professional bodies in South Africa that already have told us they want to work with us. Tomorrow we'll sign papers to get the first of the natural scientists and a whole lot of SANRAL people going, hopefully. It's massive. We have a vision to get by 2027 to get 100,000 graduates sponsored. We cannot do it without an inter-country and intergovernmental support, private sector and government. So I'm going to finish by saying the challenge with people is that people are an unconsidered asset. We don't see them as getting a return on people. So we develop an infrastructure and we develop pipes and roads and airports and harbors and things. We don't develop our people because we don't know how to get that return on that investment. So let me give you a wake-up call. There's a company in the UK called the HKA, and they look at the cost of human error across the global built environment every year. Every year, we as a human race will waste $380 billion on human error, silly, repetitive mistakes. There are 10 factors only. Sorry, that was 5 fingers, but just double those. In the UK, it's about 4.7% of every major project in the UK will end up in claims, disputes, or in extensions of time. That's massive. It costs the UK £9 billion a year in silly human errors. It's double and nearly 2.5 times that in Africa. So all of the infrastructural work that you're going to be done, you need to factor in about 9 to 9.5% of all those projects will be wasted in claims, disputes, and extensions of time. This is not something we can talk about and talk about and talk about. Sharon, I'm done. You will be seeing a lot more about us through Sharon and Minister. I'm hoping to become a very good friend. We have to invest in people. That is the future of South Africa. Thank you.
Well, if that wasn't a wake-up call, I'm not sure what will be. I'd now like to call on Shelley for a couple of moments. She's now going to focus on for us, particularly what I would have loved to have had as a youngster, the opportunity for women in the engineering and built environment. So very specifically, this is her passion, being an engineer herself.
Thanks, Sharon. Yes, Philip said, and His Excellency said, is infrastructure is the backbone of society. But from my viewpoint, and as we know, women are the backbone of society. So actually, a woman constitute 51% of society, but only 11 to 18% are working in the built environment. So my passion is around building women into the built environment, women engineers, architects, quantity surveyors, project managers. And I'm the founder of something called Women in the Built Environment. And I have currently, in the last year, got over 700 women across sub-Saharan Africa involved on our platform, which is about bringing together women to have a voice and have context around the industry that they work in, the wisdom of the crowd, where they can access a knowledge in the moment of need. So that's really important. And I was recently privileged to be invited to be a panelist on the Women in Construction and Engineering, the WAS Awards, which is the biggest engineering construction awards across Europe and the UK. And I have never seen such talent and a vision in a room of women in my entire life. It was so encouraging. So the next steps on my plate is to connect these women with my women across sub-Saharan Africa, thousands of women, but in their fields of expertise. If they're in architecture, they're connected with architects, engineers with engineers, etc. And that's working currently, but we're going to the next phase of connecting them and pairing them in mentoring relationships, but at scale. This is not a one-to-one old-fashioned mentoring process. This is about having access to the wisdom of many mentors and many experts in their field. I want to just end off with something I posted on social media recently. It was a billboard that's up in a place called North Acton. I don't know where that is. I don't know the UK very well, but must be a nice place. It said, this big billboard said, building work, a man's game. And underneath it said, a bit like football was. If anyone's interested in speaking to me about the Whitby program, please make contact. I'm very happy to share the work that we're doing and where I see the project going. Thanks very much.
Sorry that we've overrun by a few moments, but we had so much content to cover. And I have to thank both Philip and Shelley for a magnificently stimulating end to a finance discussion and an industry and education discussion that we had prior to that. So thank you very much for that. And anybody who wants to chat to the two of them about any of the ideas, please do. They are members of the chamber, so we can make connections if you don't manage to do it here. Same with any of the other speakers. And I know some of you want to meet other people that are in the room, but you've had to leave or they've left. Please make contact with us. This is what we're about, is signposting relationships and connections between people. So thanks to the panel online for being there for us for this long period of time, all the way from South Africa. One thing that COVID did bring is we can have a hybrid webinar to a hybrid webinar audience. And I do thank everyone for the technical challenges that we surpassed. It is always difficult to deal with this sort of environment, but thank you very, very much for your attendance. And there were a couple of questions from the floor, which I managed to build into that one last question. And now I invite you to relax. I'm going to. There's some finger snacks and opportunity to network and do further business together. And any further connections you want, please let us know. There has been an interest from the floor already shared in the break that we would probably look at this kind of discussion seminars as a series. So we probably will be talking to ABSA again. There are probably one or two more of these in the pipeline. Thank you very much from the chamber.